Hi everyone. This is actually going to be a bit of an opinion piece and a bit of an explanatory note as opposed to something where I actually have an opinion that's seriously one way or the other. And what I want to discuss today is the subject of scoring. And that's because I get asked a lot about what my scoring system is, what do the points mean, and, like, why do other people use other systems? Uh, the issue of scoring is actually a really touchy one with me because the truth of the matter is I bloody hate it. I don't like scoring. And that's because as a writer, I like to think that the verbiage that I use in writing a review describes everything that you need to know about the rum, and you don't need to worry about whether there's a numerical factor involved there. A number ties you down to an absolute thing. But the truth of the matter is that even though at the very beginning of my writing I never used to use scores at all, by the time I hit around review number 50 or 60, I realized that this is for beginners. This is amateur hour, and scores are a necessary evil. And I'll try and explain that. Here's the thing. They are necessary because as one gets a larger and larger stable of reviews, that become a resource in and of themselves, you run into this issue of comparability. How does the rum bar white or silver overproof 63% rate against the J. Ray and Nephew 63%, and how does that rate against the Rumfire 63%, and any other 63% or overproof rum that is white that is meant for mixing that may or may not come from Jamaica? The only way to actually do that is not to paw through a whole bunch of written reviews and to try and find out what the author meant when he said this or used that adjective, but to distill everything down to a single number, a score that will tell you how each one ranks up against the other. That's unfortunate. It's just the way things are. It's the way people's minds think. Secondly, the public, as I found for very early in my writing career, the public wants them. The public doesn't always want to read a 600-word essay or even a 200-word essay or anything like that. They just want to see what the final score is, and then they can kind of place it in their mental map of the Rumiverse. And lastly, it is actually something upon which advertisers, producers, anybody who publishes anything, makers of lists and whatever, they all think that scoring is absolutely vital in order to place something in the proper place in the pantheon. So basically, there's no way, if you continue writing or if you continue reading other people's writing, that you can escape scores altogether. That's just not possible. And the issue I have with scores, of course, is that it ties you down to things, and then you run into the inevitable problem of people starting to parse all your numbers and so on and so forth. And well, that just gets to be very tiring. But I do appreciate that after all this time and all these years of doing this, that it's become easier for me, and sooner or later everybody comes up with their own. Now, there are several different methods of scoring out there, and different writers and different bloggers or vloggers or whatever, they all have their own. Um, I'm going to start with my own because I'm most familiar with it. Initially, I started with no scores, and then I said, okay, this can't work. I need to have some way of comparing and evaluating things one against the other, and I came up with a 0 to 100 score. It wasn't quite as simple as it sounds, though. I mean, you'd think that I'd have 25 for nose, 25 for palate, 25 for finish, and 25 for some effervescent intangible or so on. It wasn't actually like that. I used to assign 5 or 10 points to things like the label and the disclosure and the presentation and the bottle and whether the bottle fit nicely in the hand or was danger of tipping over. I rated the quality of the cork. I rated the basic overall ethos of what the rum looked like. And it took a while for me to realize that these are all extraneous nonsense and fripperies that had no place in a rum review. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter what kind of container a rum is in. The fact is that the only thing that is being evaluated here is the liquid itself, and therefore eventually I abandoned that. The other problem I had with a 0 to 100 score, which is what I was using at the time, is that it really creates an issue for people who are not used to seeing it. Now, in a 0 to 100 scale, 50 is the midpoint. What that basically means is that an average rum that isn't bad and isn't good, but it's kind of passes muster, is going to rate 50 points or so, right? And you just have to think your way through that and ask yourself, if any reviewer that of your acquaintance reviews a rum and says that it's 50 points, you're going to think that this is the piece of shit. This is complete crap. And therefore, the fifth, that midpoint just doesn't work. People are more used to seeing an average rum being about 70, 75 maybe, and then good rums going further than that. And by the time you hit 80 to 90, you're hitting really good rums, and 90 plus is like walking on water time. The problem is that 0 to 100 just won't do that. And I got accused of that several times, and people were asking, well, how on earth could you rate something 75 points? That's a complete crap score. Even though on a 0 to 100 scale, 75 points is actually not bad. And on a 50 to 100 scale, which is the Parker scale that was popularized by Robert Parker, the wine critic, it equates, if you do the math right, it equates to about 80, 85 plus points, and that's actually pretty damn good, right? So eventually I abandoned the 0 to 100 score, even though a lot of people still use it. For example, Yver Delat over at Rum Revelations in Toronto uses it. He doesn't actually see how he builds up that score. He basically says that he scores everything against every other rum that he's ever tried, which is really good. But there's this little clause in his scoring method where he says that he values disclosure and transparency, which suggests that that factors in there somehow, except it's never actually explained quite how. Another person who uses a 0 to 100 scale is Serge Valentin, but if you really look at his scores carefully and start to analyze how he puts together, whether it's whiskey or rum reviews, it doesn't really matter, is that you realize that the majority of his scores are pretty much above 70, which basically suggests that he's using 50 to 100 as his basic line in the sand, so to speak. And when he scores something like 20 points or 10 points or whatever, it's sort of like a mark of contempt as opposed to a serious score. And not everybody agrees with this assessment of mine, but that's actually what I truly think it is. Because 20 on a 0 to 100 scale, when you score something 20 points, I mean, it's literally undrinkable. It's fucking poison. So, it is a mark of contempt, because I know which rums he has scored that low, and they are decent enough. They just aren't that good by his estimation, but they're by no means poison, right? So there you go. There are other systems aside from the 0 to 100 or 50 to 100, and a very interesting one is the one that Wes Bergen uses, which is 5 stars. I really like that one. I like 5 stars a lot, even though it isn't actually truly 5 stars. And Steve James over the Rum Diaries blog, before he stopped writing, also used a similar system, except that he called it, 5 points or 5 cane stalks or whatever. But because they divide them into half points, you're basically talking a 0 to 10 scale. But that is an extremely useful way of categorizing. It's a bit categorizing your scores for rums. Now, it's a bit coarse, and you can't get into the fine details of, okay, is a 4.5 star rum, there's going to be a lot of 4.5 star rums, and you can't divide it any further than that without going into quarters and so on, which is the advantage of the 50 to 100 scale, for example. But what I really like about what Wes does, and if you don't know Wes Bergen, he's the Fat Rum Pirate, and of course Steve James is the guy who runs the Rum Diaries blog. One of the things I liked about that is that they use the entire scale. They go from 0 to 5. They don't fuck around, right? And that is something that people who use any one of the other two numerical scores that go up to 100 don't often do. You'll find that there's clusters, usually between 75 and about 90. Superlative rums tend to, of course, go above that. But the really clustering of numbers is in that range, and very few bad rums go below that, no matter how bad they are. And that's just the way people are, right? You don't see scores of 55 and 60 and 65 very often. I've tried to do that with rums that I really despise, but the truth is that the majority of rums I try are actually quite good, and the quality is rising all the time, which means that my clustering is now between 80 and about 86. And for a lot of rums that I try, I do try to get dogs, but can't always get them. Okay, so there's that. Now, there are other variations on top of that. One of them is the very interesting rum barrel, which is run by my friend Alex Sandu, who works as a barman in Trailer Happiness. Now, Alex has a 0 to 100 score, but here's the interesting thing. He scores based on taste and nose and all the rest of it. He scores from 0 to 100. Right? Sorry, from 0 to 70. So he assigns 70 points for that aspect of things. And then he gives 15 points for value for money, and another 15 points for transparency, honesty, disclosure, and all the rest of it. That's kind of okay, and I like that. It tells you something about whether, the rum is worth buying, in other words, right? I'm not entirely sure it has much place in a rum review itself, because in a rum review, what you're trying to do is to talk about the rum itself, and everything else is extraneous to that, right? Which is to say, does the label really change how you feel about a rum or how it tastes? I wouldn't suggest that it does. Is the way the cork looks, is the amount of disclosure you get, does that change anything? You're tasting, you're trying to be honest and impartial about what you taste. Does the disclosure on the label change that in any fashion? I have an issue with that, and that's why I don't use this system. However, it works for him, and here's the interesting thing about it: it works if you understand what it is you're getting into, which is why I read everybody's scoring method so I can understand what it is that they're doing. And the longer that a writer writes, or blogs, or vlogs, or posts on Instagram or TikTok or any one of the various platforms out there, the longer you understand who they are and what they're all about, and therefore you can gauge, okay, their preferences are this and their preferences are that, and this is what their score means. And okay, just because he rates a four square 99 points doesn't mean that another person with a different palate isn't going to rate it somewhat less. And does he like Velier? Does he like Port Morant? Does he like Indies? Does he like, Don Q, Ron Barrilito, or any one of the Spanish style rums? These things are important because it allows you to assess the individual, because the scoring says a lot about what they consider very important. And the things that they assign those scores to is just as much. Which is why I appreciate the necessity and the desire of scoring systems to include things like disclosure. But for my method to work for me, after having written as much as I have and now started doing videos as well, I tend to dispense with everything. So a good system, therefore, should have a number of points that make sense to everybody, right? First of all, it must be consistently applied, right? And you might think that's an easy thing to do. It really, really isn't. Because think about it this way. There are rums that are made specifically for the cocktail circuit. And then there are rums that are made specifically for sipping. And these are usually very young rums versus, unaged rums. And then for the sipping quality, you've got highly aged rums that are cask strength, and they've been aged for 10, 15, 20 years or whatever, right? Should the same score apply to both? I say yes, absolutely. It must be consistently applied, which is why I treat everything as if it was meant to be sipped, and it doesn't matter to me a damn whether it works in a cocktail better than one or the other. Partly that's because I don't do cocktails as a general rule. That requires more attention, money, and effort than I currently have available. But there are some people who do that. In a perfect world, you have one score for the sipping experience and one score for the cocktail experience, but I don't know anybody who's got that kind of patience to do that kind of work, except maybe Chip Dykstra, and he's kind of out of sight, out of mind, unfortunately. Okay, the other thing that you want to see in any kind of scoring system is, aside from the disclosure of what that scoring system is, which is why I like Alex Sandoz thing so well, he really describes what he does quite neatly, is it has to be understandable by everyone. And this goes back to what I said about the 50 points being an average from the 0 to 100 scale, while 75 points is much more understandable from 50 to 100 scale, right? But the thing is, you understand a 75 to 80 point score much more easily because it's so prevalent across the liquor industry. Whiskey people use something similar, the wine people use something similar, and for the most part, you just aren't going to get anywhere if you tell somebody that this is a great rum, but it only scores 60 points. I mean, I've gotten my ass handed to me on more than one occasion precisely because of that, because people didn't understand that, so I had to change and had to go back towards it. The other thing is that even if you use a scale like Sandus or Ivar Dilat's Overt Rum Revelations or Secret Rum Bar, who doesn't actually tell you what scale he uses, but I have a feeling it's 50 to 100, as long as you can relate it to other rums of its kind. So, for example, let's assume for a second that Alex and I and Ivar and Steve James and Wes all like the J. Ray and Nephew Overproof 63%. Now, what that actually means is that we all score it the same, right? Now, Wes might score it 4.5 points. I might score it 85. Alex would score it something like, depending on how he sees the disclosure requirements, he would probably score it around 77 to about 80, and you would have a 4.5 star, or 8 or 9 points from other people as well, depending on how they score. The important thing is, though, you as a consumer and as a reader should be able to relate all of those to each other to see that it's actually the same score in each and every case. And that's sometimes very difficult when you start to introduce extraneous materials such as what is the label scores 5, the cork scores another 5, disclosure scores another 5, value for money scores another 5 or 10 or 15. It really doesn't matter. The point is, the only thing that should matter in assessing a rum is the liquid itself, and this is a point that I feel very strongly about. But I'm not certainly going to tell other people to change their scores, not at all. I mean, their scores work for them as mine works for me, and after 1,000+ reviews, you pretty much know what you're getting with me. Which brings me to my system. Now, originally, my system was the 0 to 100, and now it's 50 to 100. But essentially, what I'm doing is a quarter of my score is the nose, a quarter of my score is the taste, a quarter of my score is how it finishes off, and then there's the intangibles, the balance, the enjoyment, which is the last quarter of the score. There's a problem with that, though, and it has a serious weakness, and that's that I never give anything 100% of anything. None of the quarters basically come up to the full value. What that means is that nothing ever scores higher than 96 for me. That's a problem, because I know that there are several rums in my collection and that I've tried over the last few years that should be 96 or higher. And then that raises the question of, all right, if I scored this rum, let's assume, it is the Caputo 1973, of which there was only one bottle, and I scored that 96 points. What I have to do then is go back and think, okay, did I enjoy Velia's UF30E that much, which I only scored 92, 93? The Bristol, the Berry Brothers and Rudd 1975 Port Moran, that was 30 plus years old, that I scored 92 points. Is that better or worse than that one? And that means that at some point you may actually have to find yourself going back and changing scores, which not everybody wants to do, least of all me. I mean, good God, that's such a huge job, right? But it does create an issue at some point in applying the consistency rule, right? The past reviews that you did back when you started, your expertise and your information and everything and that you've learned in the intervening years are going to come into play. So now you rate something at 96 points, but if it isn't better than something that you had all those years ago, are you justified in changing the score back then? I've had to do that once when I moved from 0 to 100 to 50 to 100. I don't like doing it, but I have a feeling I'm going to have to do it with some of the high scores, because there's no way that of all the rums I have ever tried, nothing has ever exceeded 95, and that's got to change, because now I know that some actually deserve that, right? Okay, so we know it has to be translatable, we know it has to be consistently applied, we know that it has to be understood by the majority of people, and it has to actually talk about the liquid itself. These are the aspects that people don't often understand about how a reviewer does scoring, and this is one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this. I'm not trying to issue an opinion in the sense of that this is what should be done and this should not be done, but I wanted to at least say a little bit about what goes into the thinking behind every score that I do. So right now, after having done this for 15 years, I can usually tell within 5 minutes after you sip it a little while, you nose it for a little while, you let it rest for a while, you repeat the experience, and after about 5 minutes, I can usually tell you within 2 or 3 points, one way or the other, this is the final score that the rum is going to have. And actually, I've gotten really quite quick at it, because I kind of have to, especially when you're going to Rumfest and time is short. There is no perfect system. There is simply a system that is consistently applied, that you understand works for the person who's doing the review. I like reviewing, I like scoring now in a way that I didn't before, and I try to be consistent about it. It says something about what I consider important. I try to strip away all the extraneous stuff that isn't important to focus exactly on one thing and one thing only, which is the rum itself, and not, irrespective of what container it's in or how it's corked. And I think that's about all you can ask for in a score. How people use it and what people use it for is a completely different discussion, right? But I hope that in this 20-minute diatribe, if you want to call it that, I've tried to at least given you some idea of what it takes for us as reviewers to put a number in front of you that distills everything down to a single point, a single number. And if you have any questions or you've got some perspectives that you'd like to share with me, by all means, please do. I find this a fascinating subject, but it is one that tends to throw out, tendrils in other directions that I may not have considered. So by all means, please let me have a comment, if you will. Otherwise, have a very good evening, and I will see you next time. Take care. Bye-bye.